Is there a useful purpose to recognizing that some building was built on top of indigenous land?
100% of the US is built on top of indigenous land.
In parts of Australia, an acknowledgement of country is fairly common before major events. It's just a gesture to pay respect, and helps build towards action on bigger and more important issues. I really don't see any issue with it, but take that with a grain of salt. I am not a First Nations Australian. Emo, it is quite literally, the least we can do.
Think of it like the playing of the national anthem. It's a gesture and acknowledgement, even if the TV announcers don't stop blathering for it. Freedom isn't free, and this great nation came at an extraordinary cost. It's like saying thank you for your service to an event. If it feels fake to you, don't do it. Understand there's a somber gratitude for others.
The original idea set out by actual native activists was that if you acknowledge whose land you're on, you're supposed to actually be respectful, like you're visiting their property. It's supposed to be followed up with something like, therefore, here are the tribal laws and customs we're gonna follow, and here's the specific native people we're working with to make sure we're actually respecting their stuff. But everyone leaves off the second part. It's much easier to just mention a tribe name you found on Google than it is to actually do the hard work of getting in touch with locals and actually changing your policies to respect their traditions and stuff. They're not saying it's literally the natives' property, legally speaking / like, it's not about making settlers pay rent or something. It's more about not trampling on sacred plants, and respecting their values and not fishing out their only food source so they starve and stuff like that. There's also supposed to be more directly political outcomes. I'm really simplifying here, but if everyone respects the native government more than the colonial one, that's a strong position for the tribal government to work towards. For example, getting reparations for old treaties that were just blatantly ignored by the settlers. Unfortunately, like all sorts of radical ideas, people butchered it into a harmless liberal catchphrase that's unlikely to actually change much. In certain contexts, they are talking about literal real estate ownership of the land, but not in the exact way you'd expect. It's a whole complex topic that needs, like, a college-level course to unpack. But the literal real estate stuff only comes up in a few cases.
There's not 1 inch two of habitable land on Earth that one group of people didn't kill another group of people to take it from them.
Here in Australia we have a acknowledgement of country that is spoken before most, if not all, public events. Even podcasters use it before recording. I believe it's exactly that. Just acknowledging that the land you are on belongs to someone else and holds significance to them. Example of an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today. Name of the custodian group. And the elders, past and present and emerging.
This idea of acknowledgement of country was put forward by members of our indigenous community. If it means something to them, then its purpose and meaning is clear.
100% of everything, everywhere is built on top of indigenous land.
From the way you describe it, it does sound like the announcement was basically them just enjoying the smell of their own farts. They just want attention and to act like they're helping, even though the statement itself is meaningless. It helps people who believe in guilt by association to feel virtuous for a few moments. We do that too in Australia. I'm in Melbourne. Many people do not see it as virtue signaling or trying to look good without doing anything else. Communities I'm aware of anyway. I personally find it useful to acknowledge the traditional owners of the different lands that were unceded. We spent so many decades not bothering to think about it, that putting it into daily use before meetings and events remind us that there is still so much work to do to make the reparations that Aboriginal people deserve. I don't think traditional owners expect that buildings be torn down for them. But I do think they want acknowledgement. reparations, better opportunities and a louder voice in positions of power. Traditional owners offer a welcome to country, and non-traditional owners can offer an acknowledgement of country. Here in Australia, I think the point is to put them foremost in our minds, as they spent too long being the last thought. This is my personal experience from one city in the world. Not sure what it's like in the US. I really understand where you're coming from. If it's just words, there's no point. What am I missing? Nope, not missing anything. You got it. I don't know either. It's been there in Canada for the past few years too. Just went to my kid's parent night at his school and they started it off a recognition that the school's land is on some tribe. I tuned out. It just felt silly. It's not that I don't know about the history they suffered. I immigrated here from Africa and I know stories of every people who have suffered, including my own. I learned in school all about colonization and residential schools. I personally don't understand this either or see how it's productive in any way. All you're doing is having people feel the injustice, reminding them of it, and then not doing anything about it. I suffered my own trauma in ethnic conflict in Africa. I've had to deal with PTSD and all kinds of issues related to it. Even kicked off my childhood home. I've worked through a lot of stuff and still continue to. What good would it do me to have someone say they recognize this event and then not do anything about it? It's just going to ruin my damn mood as I'm trying to enjoy a comedy show, trying to move on in my life, trying to put the troubled past behind me and move on in life. Maybe there are some historical victims who find comfort in it. I personally don't know any, but they could exist. But I'd argue there are equal numbers who don't find it comforting. People like myself who try and move forward in life. I don't really think white people are genuine when saying it. It comes off like they're reading from a script, which just rubs further salt on the wound. So I don't get it either. I think the only people who benefit are those who like to stir the pot with people's emotions. At some point, I think you just accept what happened, move forward, and try and do better. History is too messed up to stay in the past. Heck, I'm sure the very indigenous tribe whose land Europeans stole is land that very tribe stole, killed another tribe. Where is the justice for that other tribe? As a Canadian, help them with proper infrastructure, community, mental health resources, and move on. They, like many of us, take a loss in recent history. No point living in that loss. There's always another season. Edit. I think a large part of this truth and reconciliation came about trying to model what Nelson Mandela did in South Africa. The difference though should be obvious. Mandela did it while the people who were involved in apartheid were alive. Apartheid impacted every segment in South African society. The victims of apartheid were alive. The oppressors in apartheid were alive. The whole point of truth and reconciliation was for everyone to recognize what happened and how they each contributed at an individual level. As an example, Mandela was famous for being really kind to his prison guards, the very people who were in charge of keeping him in prison. Yet, he knew they were just guards doing their job. Yet, they too needed to recognize what they were doing to him. They were the hands of whatever system was in charge. Even if they were doing their job, did they reflect on how they treated a prisoner? Did they even humiliate them or treat them as less than a human? That was personal. That was truth and reconciliation. The land issues are too far gone in history that truth and reconciliation is pointless. I think there could be one for residential schools. Having the old students be in the same room as the staff and tell their stories and put that on TV. That could be truth and reconciliation. Yet, for the average Canadian who has no ties to it and pretty much just lives with nothing to do with the issue, it is pointless. It seems weird, like if your land was conquered a long time ago, Would you want the conquerors continually throwing that fact in your face hundreds of years later? We're not going to give the land back. Just tell everyone how we took it from you. Doesn't seem all that nice. How many places on Earth can't you say this about? Also, what about the vast swaths of lands Native Americans conquered from each other before Europeans even got there? People act like all of the Americas was one big peaceful paradise before Europeans introduced them to warfare. It's part of a program of reconciliation with the tribal governments. In a lot of places, the entire East Coast up to the Mississippi, for example, were tricked, threatened, and forced off their land and relocated at gunpoint hundreds of miles. In other places, the tribes were promised access to land which was never enforced, are guaranteed equal rights to share the land while settlers slowly encroached and pushed them out. Some bands never signed any treaties, but were forced into allowing colonial law to supersede their own laws on their own lands. In British Columbia, Native Americans could be shot on white land until after 1900. And since the entire province was considered by the whites to be white land, they were legally shot anytime someone wanted to shoot them. No Native or black woman could give evidence in court for any reason. The vast majority of that land was settled at gunpoint. All over the West was a bounty on Native scalps, the most rewarding being male children. We had a system of cultural genocide to kill the reservations. The idea was to disconnect the children so much from their culture they rejected it and were rejected by it. By acknowledging the land, you acknowledge all of this happened. It wasn't okay. And in places where the land is supposed to be shared via treaty, the reservations have as much right to it as the government. Respect. Most of the good spots in the U.S. were built on stolen land. There's an attempt, in some places, to openly recognize and show respect to the tribes whose land was stolen by the government. 100% of every land with exception of Antarctica has had its borders changed or been taken over by a superior group. Do individual Indian tribes apologize to each other for taken territory before Europeans arrived? The purpose is to shift the way people think about their surroundings from something that just naturally came to be the way it is to something that was actively taken from indigenous people and that they still have claim to. Basically, it posits that the acknowledgement lessens erasure of indigenous people and history and recognizes that indigenous people still exist and are still harmed by colonization. That said, one major critique of this practice, or doing this practice alone, from indigenous people is exactly what you just said. It's virtue signaling and really does little except maybe make people very slightly more aware. Since you mentioned being from Latin America, I'm not, but my family is. I think one thing that's a notable difference in thinking about indigenous people in the US versus in Latin America is that indigenous cultures have unfortunately been so heavily erased in Latin America that it's hard for people with indigenous ancestry to even know that or reconnect with their culture. Despite most people having some, often a decent amount, of it. In the US, way fewer people have indigenous ancestry, but the lineages and histories are somewhat more preserved, which isn't to understate their erasure. They've had it incredibly rough too. So indigenous issues are more distinct, I think. We love to pray for people and claim to support issues without actually doing something about, for said people, issues. I think this is similar.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Eracast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.